Good morning. Great to be here with you this morning. And we've been talking about God, and last time we talked about His attributes. And this time we're going to talk about His nature. That is His character, His personality, who He is, that kind of thing. Hopefully going to get to know God a little bit in our lesson this morning. So as we talk about His nature, I want to think a little bit about maybe His personality or character. If God is an uncaring God, if He's an uncaring God who's kind of absent or distant, far away, then when He interjects Himself into human timeline and changes everything for humans, as like when He puts Adam and Eve in the garden and then manages them eating the fruit and sinning, as He talks to Cain and Abel, after Cain gives an unacceptable sacrifice, as He tells Noah to build an ark and brings judgment on the world, or confuses the languages in the Tower of Babel. As He does all of these things to put all the pieces in the right place so that Jesus can come and ultimately offer our salvation. Does that sound like a distant God who doesn't care? It doesn't. That doesn't work, really. So He's not distant and uncaring. What about that judgment in the day of Noah? Is God this angry, authoritarian, disciplinarian? Is He unreasonably angry, bringing judgment at the least infraction? Well, if that were the case, then Him providing a way for our sins to be forgiven, Him giving us life and breath and food and gladness and joy wouldn't really make sense. So that's not an accurate picture either. And yet, if He's always loving, kind, caring, then His judgment doesn't make sense, right? How do we make sense of who God is? That's the challenge I want to put before you this morning. Who is our God? I want to suggest to you that He is a father. That a father has the motivation to deal with his children in this way. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says He creates us in His own image. Male and female, He creates the human race. And in Luke 3, in the genealogy of Christ, as it goes back from Christ all the way to Adam, He describes Adam here, the son of Adam, the son of God. Now, Adam is not the son of God in the same way that Jesus, the only begotten of the Father, is, the unique Son is, right? But He does come forth from God, does He not? As God molds His body out of the dirt and breathes the breath of life into it, He comes forth from God. And so here the text says that He is the Son of God in that way. So God has a built-in interest in helping His creation, His children. We just had the reading, verse 6 of chapter 12 of Hebrews says, "For the Lord disciplines the one whom He loves and chastens or chastises every son whom He receives." He looks at us as His children. And that's going to make sense of His chastising, because He wants to help us be who we should be. And we'll go on with that here in a little bit. I'm about to run ahead of myself. So He trains us. As we look further there in chapter 12 of Hebrews, it says, "We have had human fathers who corrected us. We paid them respect. We should respect even more so the God of heaven," right? But then He says, "They indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them," right? And so we acknowledge sometimes our dad's wisdom falls short, right? Sometimes they don't do the right thing. But what about God? It says, "But He for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness." He is the perfect Father. And He's training us. He's helping us. He's assisting us move on to higher plateaus. I used to think that when hard times came in life, that either it was because that, like Job, Satan was warring against me, and there was nothing really I'd done wrong, but that it was just a difficult time that I was to remain faithful through. And then maybe other times suffering was because that I had done something wrong or had some wrong thinking or wrong attitude, and that God is correcting that. He's like, hey, fix this, Matt. And these are becoming kind of blended and blurred together for me. Because as a father myself, I do want to fix my children's wrong attitudes. And when they make mistakes, I do want them to fix those mistakes. But I also want them to grow stronger. I want them to have tenacity. I want them to have grit so that when they come to the hard places in life, they don't just throw up their hands and bury their heads in the sand, but they keep on keeping on. Isn't that what you would want for your children? Right? And so, no matter what the situation is at hand, it's all training. And it's all of this chastening then is for our profit. And allows us to be partakers of His holiness if we are trained by it. So you can kind of see then how the perfect Father cares for our best interest. He does this for our good. And that's hard to buy sometimes, isn't it? When we're in the midst of pain and suffering, when we're not getting what we think we need, when there's something that we really, really, really want and we know we shouldn't have it, it's hard not to look at God and say, why aren't you giving me what I want, God? Father, Dad, please let me have it. This is hard to swallow, that He does these things for our best interest, because I don't like it when times are difficult and when I'm not getting what I want. Do you? I don't like it. And as His kids, as His children, that's the stumbling block that I want to address this morning. That's a big piece that I want to look at. He does these things for our best interest. Again, it's for our profit. He's not doing it because He's upset. He's not doing it because He's angry at us. He's not doing it because He's ashamed of us or disappointed. He's doing it so that we can improve. Unfortunately, you see, there's a secret that God knows about humans. And that secret is that when everything is going really well, we don't listen very well. We don't try to improve in general when things are going great. How many ball teams after winning the championship are like, all right, hit practice in the morning? That's not how it works. You won. You take a break, you rest, right? When things are going my way and I'm planning for my vacation and saving up and looks like I'm ready for a rainy day, when all my friends like me, when things are going well, right? Do I dig in and I say, why, Lord? Please help me to understand. Is that when I say those words? No, it's not. When everything's going great, is that when I say, I've really been needing to improve on this particular thing that I don't do so well on. I need to improve my faith, or I need to quit this tendency over here toward this sin that I have. No, that's not when I am given to introspection. That's not when I examine myself, is it? God knows that about us, and He knows that, unfortunately, we need difficulty. The healthy environment for us humans is to have times of difficulty and hardship that make us dig deep within ourselves and lean on God as our Father to help us get through whatever it is. And then, a lot of times, the sun will come out after the storm, and we get a break until the next time of growth comes along. Look at how God dealt with Cain. And I think this is interesting because of how Cain reacts. Did God warn Cain? If you'd like to, you can flip back there to Genesis chapter 4. You'll remember, beginning of verse 5, that Cain had brought an offering that was not what God asked for. It was not of faith, Hebrews tells us. This offering was of the fruit of the ground, because Cain was a farmer, and he had the fruit of the ground, whatever it was he had been growing. And that's what he brought to God. Is that a sacrifice to give up part of what you have raised and produced? Of course it is, right? So here it is. This is what I'm going to give God. Unfortunately, it's not what God asked for. And so God did not respect Cain and his offering. Cain's response is to get angry, because he wanted God to accept his offering. He wanted fellowship with the Father, but he wanted it on his terms. He wanted God to accept his offering that he decided to give instead of the one God asked for. And so God says to Cain in verse 6, "Why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do what I asked you to, all this problem just goes away." It's not that hard, Cain. Look at the next thing he says there in the middle of verse 7. "And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." Did he say you have already sinned? That's not what he said. He said it's lying at the door. Had Cain already failed to obey God? Yes, he had. But God is concerned about what's about to happen more than what has just happened. He says, "Cain, sin is trying to get you. And if you continue on in this attitude of being angry because I don't do things your way, because you didn't have life given to you on your terms, a much worse sin is about to happen." And it does, doesn't it? That evil attitude in Cain results in him killing his brother. Did God warn Cain? He did warn him. Before Cain even thought about killing his brother, God comes to him and says, "Look, this is going the wrong direction. You're in trouble. You're about to let sin in the door with this attitude of having to have life on your own terms." He was caring for Cain's best interest. After Cain kills his brother, God punishes Cain. He, most notably, for our purposes this morning, he makes it where the ground will not yield its strength anymore. What did Cain love to do? Farm. What did God take away from him? The strength of the ground, the result of his farming. In our child training, by the way, that might be a little hint, a little tip. Make sure that if a child is misbehaving or having a bad attitude or doing something wrong, that it doesn't get them what they're trying to get. It doesn't get them what they want, what they're trying to achieve with that. That's exactly, God matched the punishment to the wrong attitude here. Let's look at Job. We mentioned Job a minute ago. We talk about suffering, Job just immediately pops to mind. For me, at least. First of all, before the book ever opens, we see that Job is very, very blessed. He's a wealthy man. He's got children. He's got a family. He's a happy guy. He's got it all, really. God had blessed Job. And so Job knew about God's goodness. But God allowed hardship and suffering to come on Job. His animals are either captured or killed or run off. His children die. And finally, God allows Satan to afflict him with these boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. He's so miserable with these things that he's sitting in the ash heap outside the city where they burn their trash, using broken pieces of pottery to scrape these painful boils. I don't know if they were itching. I don't know what word we would describe, but I know that he was miserable. God allowed suffering and hardship to come on Job. Did Job give up his faithfulness? He didn't. He made some mistakes. God rebukes him for his mistakes, but he doesn't give up on God. He stays faithful to God through the end, and in the end, God rewards Job for his faithfulness. Do you see a pattern of fatherhood here, anywhere in here? Whether it's sin or without sin, the hardship comes, and God rewards those who are faithful to him. Job became a much stronger follower of God through everything that he suffered. Can you imagine next time the Sabaeans run off his camels? He's like, whatever, that's fine. I've already been through this. I know how this story turns out. That's fine. God's got my back. What about when bad things happen to us? What about when tragedy strikes in our lives? If it's a new tragedy that we've never faced before, a lot of times it gets us down and it hurts. But we need to look to God and realize we will be stronger next time this comes around. Does God warn us like he warned Cain? Any admonitions for us? Any communication from God that we have today? We've got a whole Bible full of communication, right? We've got stories and laws and so on and so forth. God has definitely communicated with us as he did Cain. Probably a lot more so than he did Cain, if we'll read our Bibles. And God lets us make choices. And that's kind of where the problem comes in. It's people's choices, right? That's how others get hurt, isn't it? People choosing to be selfish and abusive and whatever all it is. Making choices that they didn't think would hurt other people, but that then do hurt other people. Innocent people getting hit by drunk drivers, a lot of times the example I like to use. There's a lot of pain and suffering in this world, and it, in large part, came from us making choices. God then, a lot of times, lets us suffer for our bad choices. Not always, but a lot of times. Sometimes he lets us suffer when we don't make bad choices. Sometimes we are the innocent person that gets hit by the drunk driver. But he rewards us when we are loyal to him and pursue what is good. Do you see how all of these things God does for our best interest to help us grow and improve and become stronger? That's hard to swallow. But if you've ever been on the backside of an education or learning a lesson and then gone to a place where you needed those lessons and you needed that strength, you needed that education, and you've got it and you're ready and you're prepared and you handle the situation at hand, well, you do really well with it because of the past hardships, then you understand this perfectly. The perfect Father provides for us as well. On Mars Hill, Paul puts it to the pagans there that it is the unknown God, the God that they do not know, who is providing life, breath, and all things. We know that he gives us food and clothing. And he gives us every good and perfect blessing, James 1 says. As we woke up this morning and began to breathe, it would have been wise for us to thank God for the blessing of a new day, especially as beautiful and sunshiny as this day is. God gives us, He provides us a realization that our choices matter. I'm probably not the only one in the room who's hurt someone else with something I've done or said. You ever hurt anybody else with your choices? Do our choices matter? Yeah, they matter a lot, don't they? They matter to the people around us, and they matter for ourselves. What would God have to do in order to make sure nobody ever got hurt? To make sure the bad things never happened? What would God, what brought in suffering and death in the beginning? What brought that in? That was Adam and Eve, wasn't it? In the garden, and they ate the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this brings sin in the world. People's choices brings sin and death into the world. So for God to make sure that no one ever gets hurt, He's going to have to take our choices away. We're going to have to be just kind of robots always doing what's good and right, regardless of what we want to do. And on the surface, it sounds pretty good, right? How would we choose a relationship with this Father? How would we say, I want to be your son, I want to be your daughter, if we had no choice but to do what was right and become His children? Would that be fulfilling for God if no one ever chose Him, but we were His children because we had to be? That's not fulfilling for God. Would it be fulfilling for us? Would we take joy and delight in this special relationship? Being children of the King of the universe who created all things. If we were just there because we had to be? That doesn't work, does it? So God in His wisdom gives us choice. Because of choice, sin and death come into the world and people are hurt. It's no longer that very good world that God created and established at the end of chapter 1 of Genesis. So our choices matter. If you've ever thought to yourself, as you suffered some of the curses on people, if you've ever suffered thorns or wasps or working by the sweat of your brow or pain in childbearing or all of that kind of stuff, and you've ever said to yourself, oh, Adam and Eve, really? Why'd you blow it for the rest of us? Right? Then you know choices matter. And God has provided that through an understanding of where we came from. He's given us His Word, the Bible. My grandmother would tell me stories, primarily my grandmother's. My one grandmother had like a news article or news story from, like 50 years of news stories, and she would just pull out of that repertoire whatever fit the occasion. Matt, don't run with those scissors. There was a little boy who ran with scissors, and he tripped, and he fell after his mother had told him not to run with scissors, and he impaled himself right there in his guts. And it could have been his eye. I missed that news story. I didn't know I was about to die. Yeah, she had all these stories, and maybe even more personally are the stories about what happened with my family. How they started this grocery store and then they moved and all the stuff that happened, and how my uncle had a 5 and dime store during the Great Depression and it did really well. All these stories. You know what? I soaked those in as a kid. I remember those, and I really couldn't tell you what she told me to do or not to do, to be honest, at this point. But I remember the stories. God gives us the same tool in the Bible. He gives us all of these stories to show us who He is and to show us how we should live because of that. And He gives us the moral laws and a forewarning I believe it's in, I forgot to put that one down. I believe it's in Deuteronomy that Moses points out to the children of Israel, which nation around you has this good of a law with these moral truths in it? That's a rough paraphrase. We have the same thing. We have the very highest quality moral guide anywhere on the earth, ever. And of course, he tells us that judgment is coming. Isn't that cool? Like, it's not like at the end, gotcha. You didn't know it, but you go to hell if you don't live right. Right? It's not like that. He's told us ahead of time what's going to happen so that we can prepare. He gives us hope, comfort, and a reason to keep pressing on. The whole fact that he tells us, here's how to live, here's what's going to happen. If you're faithful to me, you get a reward at the end where there's no more tears, no more sorrow. That's so comforting. To know that God is the absolute best judge ever, that he will judge correctly, that nobody will go to hell who shouldn't, and nobody will sneak into heaven who deserved punishment. That's very comforting to me. And sometimes as I look around, I don't really know which way that's going to go for a particular person. But God does. So I can take comfort in that. Gives us a reason to keep pressing on. No matter how bad the trials get here, we know that there's this reward and this rest after it's all over with, right? Guess what else our Father provides for us? He provides a way back to fellowship with him. So let's go over the training process. Garden of Eden, you've got all this good food in there, every tree that's good for food. The people are put in there, and in the midst of the garden, not off on the edge, not in the back corner, not with a fence around it or a hedge of thorns around it where you can't get to it. In the midst, easy to access, is both the tree of life that they can eat and live forever, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they can eat and bring death into the world if they disobey God. Those are right in the middle, easily accessible. If you want to teach your toddler not to touch something that you say not to touch, you can't put it up on the top shelf out of reach. They'll just touch it again next time you get it down, or they'll climb up the shelves. Ask me how I know that. It's probably from being a little boy who climbed up the shelves. That's what happened first before I had kids. So, no, what you have to do is you have to put it right down there on the coffee table, and you have to say, don't touch that. And if you're a good trainer, you're going to find something they want to touch, and you're going to put it right there, and probably they're going to decide they want to touch it. And then you're going to smack their hand, you're going to say, no, don't touch that. And probably they're going to touch it again. And you're going to smack their hand again. No, don't touch that. And the reason you do that is because eventually, after maybe 3 or 4 hand smacks for normal kids and 13 or 14 for Hodge kids, like me, then they're going to change their minds. They're going to make the decision, it's not worth it. I wanted the toy, I want that cookie, but it's not worth it because Dad's going to smack my hand again. Mom's going to smack my hand again. And that hurts and I don't like it, so now I'm changing my mind. I don't want that. Because, and associated with that is this command, don't touch. What did God do? He puts the trees in the midst of the garden, easy to reach. And he said, don't touch that. Actually, he didn't. He just said, don't eat it. Eve is the one who said, God told us not to touch it. I think that's funny. And so they touched it, right? And then the consequences happen. God knows that bad choices are going to be made. And that's not the end of the story. Adam and Eve didn't go to hell necessarily for eating the fruit. They and we had the chance to repent, to change our minds, not touch the forbidden thing, and we can go to heaven. None of that would be possible without Jesus, right? Because when we violate the holiness of God, we no longer are able to have fellowship with Him, right? We're no longer worthy of fellowship with Him. But because Jesus sent His Son and paid the price with His blood, with His life, poured it out for us, paid the penalty that we should have paid, in a sense. Now we can make the mistake, suffer consequences, and yet go to heaven eternally. He makes a way back to fellowship with Himself. He lets us learn, make wrong choices, and learn to make better ones, and still go to heaven one day. And He gives us that resurrection. If we become like Jesus, then we can resurrect like Jesus. Matter of fact, I want to read from Romans 6. Romans 6, beginning in verse 4, says, "Therefore we were buried with Him through baptism into death, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life." When we go under those waters, just like Jesus went into the depth of the earth, as we go into the depths of the waters, we then are united with that death that He paid for our sins. And it's through being united with that death that we are able to rise up and live with Him again. Let's see here. Verse 5, "For if we have been united together in the likeness of His death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of His resurrection. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with Him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin." We have to learn not to sin. We have to learn not to give in to ourselves. We serve an awesome, loving Father. The process we have to go through is often very painful. It's often very difficult. But it is this process that makes us who we are as Christians. There we go. As we close this lesson out and bring our focus back to our God and who He is, remember that Ephesians 4:6 says, "There is one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all." As we talk about this training process, you can see how God is working in every single Christian's life. He's above us, He's inside of us, and He's among us. He's throughout our midst. There it is. Through good times or bad. Through good times and bad. We remember that disobeying God brought death and hardship to the world, and that seeking God brings light and reward. That God trains us so that we learn to make better choices. And we should see God as a Father who allows things to happen to train us, to make us better and stronger. If we look at our hardships and we say, God, You're a mean, harsh God to do this to me. Aren't we having the attitude of Cain? God, You should have accepted the sacrifice that I wanted You to accept. You should have made my life the way I wanted it to be. You should have given me what I desired. That's not a righteous attitude. We want to move on to something better than Cain's attitude. We want to have an attitude that says, Father, I don't understand right now. Anybody else ever been there as a kid, by the way, didn't understand what their dad was trying to, or mom was trying to get through to them? I have. I was there lots of times. And as I'm older and look back on it, I get it now. And so we need to realize that at some point we can look back on this and get it. But right now we don't understand. Somebody asked me recently, do you think God has a reason for everything he does? Yeah, but we don't always know what it is. And we have to accept it and move on and look to him for healing in spite of how difficult things may be. So as we look at God, I want you to remember God as a father. God is a parent who loves us, who provides for us, and who's training us, who's strengthening us through everything that happens. If you're here this morning and perhaps you need to make your life right with God. Perhaps you haven't been buried with him in baptism. Perhaps you haven't contacted that price that he paid for your sins and your mess ups. If so, you're still in those sins. And you need to fix that. Come to God, come to the loving Father, because he has a lot better things in mind for you than you could ever possibly accomplish on your own. If you need to, please come as we stand and sing.